I'm Melissa, I'm a PhD student in my second year looking at autism and support for adults who are autistic. And basically the reason that this was important for me to look at was because when you're autistic, you do also get mental health difficulties. I'm going to talk about that today, but for me, it was about making sure there's support, both for autistic traits, but also for the mental health difficulties that can arise. And that's ultimately what the talk today is about. It's about how autism and mental health interlink and how they're separate at the same time. So just to go over what autism is from a personal perspective, we look at comparisons first of all to neurotypicals, and that's not just for autism, that's for any neurodivergent conditions that can be dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, ADHD. And so when we talk about neurotypical, we're not just talking about non-autistics, we're talking about people that don't have a neurodevelopmental condition at all. So by neurotypical, we mean people that learn through social and environmental interaction, and so they meet natural developmental milestones, they walk on time, they talk on time, they're very socially navigated, very interested in social stimuli in the environment, and as a result usually quite social and understanding of social and communication nuances. So it broadly describes the default of human cognition, the one that you will all know naturally. And of course there are variations by person, by upbringing, environment, and as well by mental health. So not all neurotypicals will be social, not all will understand social nuances. It's just people, regardless of personality, that don't have a co-occurring neurological condition, but can have mental health difficulties. And as well, neurotypicals generally understand stimuli response interactions, and this is important for later on. So neurotypicals often, if they're sad, they know why they're sad, for example. So in comparison, somebody who's autistic learns more through literal information and facts, so there's less interaction with the social environment growing up. It's more about wanting information. So to give an example of this, if somebody's autistic and they've got language difficulties, then they might not necessarily understand through watching people socially that the word dog means the animal dog. They might just think it's a common name for the animal, whereas a neurotypical will probably pick that up quite naturally. And this is where it can tie into developmental difficulties and delays. And it's not always in language. For example, I didn't have any language delays. I was quite an early speaker, but I did have significant motor delays, so it tends to be one or the other or both. And it's basically, when we talk about autism, we're just describing an alternative of human cognition. So there are still skills and there are still difficulties. It's equal to being neurotypical, it's just different, basically. And we do have significant difficulty with stimuli responses. So when we look at mental health, this means that there's often a difficulty in understanding what's triggered our own emotions, what the emotion actually is, and that is then important for managing mental health difficulties. And again, this varies by person, so all autistic people are usually different. Upbringing has an impact, environment, so even just by context, an autistic person can have completely different difficulties and skill sets, and also mental health has an impact on that as well. So just to show you an example that you're all probably familiar with, is exam season. So talking from personal experience, one of my exams on my undergraduate degree was very overwhelming. It was just because we had a block of quite a few exams, and this was the last of that block. So I started to feel very overloaded by everything, and as a result, I started to experience pain from soft touch. Not all autistic people will experience this. For me, I do have hypersensitivities to touch. But it was basically, I was feeling a bit under the weather and got a fluffy gown to try and feel a bit better mentally, and found that I had to stop wearing sleeves or the gown because it felt like pins and needles, like pinpricks on my arms, which obviously it shouldn't do. And I had no idea that this was linked to the stress of the exam. It took somebody to say, you've been really stressed with your exams, that's why you're constantly overloaded, and that's why now the gown is suddenly very painful. And then, usually as a result of frequent overload, you start to get frequent meltdowns, which I'm going to talk a bit about what a meltdown is later on. But basically the only thing that I was aware of was that I was struggling with overload. There was too much input, too much going on, and I wasn't tying it back to the fact that exam season was causing the stress, which requires somebody else to notice. As a comparison, somebody who's neurotypical will still feel stressed about exams, but normally they're very aware that that's then causing any anxieties that come afterwards. So they might be very aware that any anxiety, no matter how it presents, is about the fact that they're scared of not succeeding. And so normally they might get upset, but they will be able to identify why they're upset, and then they can work on a plan of action. Autistic people can still work on a plan of action. We're very good at that. It's just that we need that identification first of all of what has actually gone wrong. And the problem is, if you don't identify the trigger, this can cause mental health struggles because you're just constantly in overload, you're constantly not feeling the best, and you don't know why, and that's frustrating. So before you know it, mental health struggles have arose. So what's important to talk about first is that taking mental health out of the equation for a moment, being autistic requires coping management, basically. And the level of coping that you have available at any one time is determined by the level of difficulties. And difficulties aren't necessarily anything bad. So for example, for me, one thing that takes up a lot of coping is going on holiday, booking a holiday, planning a holiday. And a lot of people I speak to don't understand that because they say, well, you're getting to go away, that should be a really positive experience. But until I get there, it's not a positive experience. It's a lot to cope with about what's going to change, what's going to be different, how do I know what this place is going to be like, is there going to be food that I like? And so it doesn't necessarily mean that the person doesn't like the thing they're not coping with, it's just anything that contributes to what you've got to think about basically takes up coping for you. So the more difficulties you have, the higher potential it is that you're going to have a meltdown. And so that's really problematic, and we have to continuously manage how much we've got to cope with, how many difficulties there are in our life. So you might hear it referred to as spoon theory. It's not a scientific theory. It came up with by autistics and people that support autistic people in order to explain to other autistic people their own coping mechanisms and how to manage those. I'm going to use block theory today just because I personally think it's a bit easier to comprehend than spoons. So I do have to give complete credit to my mum for this, who came up with this analogy to help explain to me and my brother, help us manage our own coping. So it's basically, for today's analogy, if we just think of 5 blocks, and every single person has these 5 blocks of coping available every single day. Now, it would still work the same for a neurotypical person, it would just be different things that make up those blocks of coping. So for example, 5 blocks for me, if I was doing a lecture like today, the first block would be waking up late, the rain could be a second block, the bus being late, the wind smelling a certain way, and then a light flickering. So before I've even got to my destination, there's 5 things that have took up all of my coping. And the difference is that for a neurotypical, they might not get to the first block until they've had a delay in waking up or the bus, but they probably wouldn't register the things like smells in the air or sensation of rain on the skin, for example. So it's the same process for both, it's just that we have a lot more that we're taking in input-wise, and that takes up more coping for us. So if we were thinking of 5 blocks, normally by the time you've got 4 blocks of coping, you've gone into overload. So overload is an experience where it feels like you've took too much information in, you're not processing properly, so the way you speak can slow down, your mind feels like it's racing, there's so much going on, it feels like there's no way that you can manage it. And if you don't manage to get a hold of that and then something else takes up a further block of coping, then it's meltdown. So this analogy is pretty good because it shows the amount that you can get to before the blocks tumble over, which would be the meltdown. So meltdown is described as a loss of control. Usually it doesn't mean that there's going to be any violence. For me, it's just excessive crying, feeling very, very distressed. The person normally looks like they're having a breakdown, basically. And it's completely different from a tantrum, which is difficult in children to identify the difference because it's not about obtaining a goal, it's not about making something happen, it's just about there's too much going on in my brain and I can't function right now and everything's just shut down, basically. So the amount of blocks that you've got this is just 5 that we've used to make today a bit easier, where it will completely vary by the individual. So one day you might have 5 blocks, the next day you might have 10. It would also vary by age. Kids tend to have a lot less coping available, often because they're still learning, they're still trying to understand the world. Also, things that you haven't coped with as well as a child, you can learn to cope with as an adult through coping mechanisms. But also time and place. So, for example, if I was to be going to a concert, because concerts tend to be around special interests for me, then I would already have a bit extra coping because I'm so excited to be going that if there's rain, if the bus is delayed, I'm probably not going to notice as much. Whereas if I was to be going to the dentist where I know there's going to be sensory input, then instantly that's 2 blocks gone. So it's about managing that every day and just being aware of what things have taken up your coping or the person that you know is coping, and then trying to manage that. So removing any extra things that could contribute and just being aware that that person is a little bit closer to overload and meltdown at that point in time or at that day. So typically when we think about this kind of theory, we think that neurotypicals have a bit of a higher threshold, so it takes longer for them to get to the point of what we would call a meltdown. But for autistic people, there's also the extra factors that contribute a bit quicker, so we're constantly trying to keep up and manage that coping. Now, in order to help a level of coping that's gone too high, there's various things that you can do, but ultimately you want to remove the metaphorical blocks. You want to take away anything that's contributing to what you've got to cope with, and that will vary by person, but typically you just want to remove the trigger, if that's possible, as soon as possible. And then distraction and similarly positive experiences can bring the person down a bit or remove a block of coping. So if I wasn't coping with the rain, for example, but I had headphones on me and could play some music, that might remove the coping with the rain. So it's just about constantly managing what you're processing at any one time. So there's a bit of a difference between short-term and long-term coping mechanisms. For short-term coping, I would instantly go to a special interest. So for me, that would easily be a song, because that's something that's quick, it's easily accessible. Also repetition, so what we call stimming, which is repetitive behaviour, and that can be just pacing up and down, or it can be having like a fidget toy, like a fidget spinner, or music, which can easily be repeated over and over. Because focusing on the music example, a lot of people always ask, how can you listen to the same song on repeat for your whole shift? It's quite easy, because parsing down the parts of a piece of music that is the same every time is a lot easier to process, because you know what's coming. There's that expectancy, there's no change. And having one thing that you can control that's expected basically means that anything unexpected is a little bit easier to cope with. Also positive distractions, so whether you're autistic or not, you've probably had a situation where you've had a lot to cope with, you've been overwhelmed, as somebody said, why don't you have a hot drink to calm down a bit? So the British stereotype of having a cup of tea, basically. And that can be anything that you enjoy, food or drink, or even a task. That just helps you feel a little bit better about yourself. It applies to being autistic as well, and helping coping, anything that's just a simple comfort to you. One thing that really helps is a conversation, so especially if you're at the threshold of going into overload or being in meltdown, just having the option to get in touch with a family member or a friend that really understands. So not only is it the comfort of, I like this person, I like talking to them, but it's the thing of they know you enough to say, right, how much have you had to cope with today? What can we recommend to get that coping down? So it's just about having a network of people to access. And also any task that will just completely preoccupy you and take your mind off anything that's in the immediate environment to calm you down a little bit. Reducing processing is also a good thing. So the easiest thing to do usually is block out a scent. So a lot of us will carry headphones or ear defenders. So if all of a sudden everything's getting too much, even if it's not an auditory input that's putting you into overload, just shutting off one single sense can calm you down, because there's less things coming in to process. Finding a quiet environment is always the best thing, especially if you're in overload and there's a risk that one more block's going to push you into meltdown. It's safer for you to be in a safe environment, so often mapping out where they're going to be before you get there. So then if you have a meltdown, nobody's going to look and think, oh my God, what's happening, and try and intervene in a harmful way. it's also better for you because there's more space to process things. And obviously, as I said before, if you can, then the instant thing to do is just remove the trigger. So it's important to note that with this idea, whatever triggers you at the top isn't the problem, it's all the things that are built up. So whatever feels like it's pushed you into a meltdown isn't the only thing, and it's about knowing that and keeping a track, either mentally or writing it down, of the things that you've had to cope with that day so that you can manage it. But regardless of the fact that the thing that's triggered you isn't the overall cause, there's many different factors. If you can remove that trigger, then that will usually help. And even better still, if there's multiple triggers that you've had to cope with that you can get rid of, then that will free up some coping. So it's just all about reducing the amount that you've got to cope with. And it does completely depend on the situation, what is in your power to control. But if you're in a situation where you can't get away and you can't control what's happening in the environment to trigger you, then you can still have things on you, like a fidget toy, for example, to keep your mind occupied. So then also there's long-term coping. So when you're autistic, you know that these situations are going to happen. They don't always happen often, but inevitably they happen at some point. So there are things that you can do on a longer-term basis. So for me, if I've had to deal with something and it's had a lasting effect, so I've had the meltdown and the trigger's not gone away, say like grief, for example, I would get overly engaged in a special interest. People say that special interests are harmful, but they're not. As long as the person's balancing the things they need to do every day, they're a great comfort. And for me, it would be less about an instant repetition of a song, it would be more of a thematic focus. So if I had something long-term to cope with, I would get out a book and research my special interest. I would be trying to engage in it constantly, documentaries, music, videos, anything that I could get a hold of just to keep my mind focused on the thing that is positive to me. And that would help me to cope each day. Alone time is an important one. So it's a misconception that autistic people don't like to socialise. We do like to socialise, especially with the right people. But we do also need alone time, that's quite important. So that just helps us to process any sensory information and also any emotional information. So if something's happened that's made you feel any emotion, good or bad, it's just good to have time to think over it, what caused the emotion. Do you need to react to it? Do you need to deal with it? Those kinds of things. Removal of negativity is also an important one. So if a situation or a person is constantly triggering a bad reaction in you, and you can think about it and attribute something to that personal situation, then it's completely fine to just avoid it when you can. Obviously, that's not always an option. But if you know that something is going to trigger you and it can be avoided, that's completely viable. Also, preparations are massively important. So familiarising yourself, if it's somewhere you've never been, get pictures on the internet. If there's a virtual plan of a building, get the virtual plan of the building. Look for any quiet spaces nearby that you can escape to, restaurants that are going to be comfortable for you to eat in. Having any assistive aids on you, like ear defenders, fidget toys, making sure you're well prepared. And also having a short-term plan. So referring back to what we spoke in the last slide, making sure you know what you would want to do if your coping was suddenly gone, or having somebody with you or available on a phone that will know how to implicate a plan. And sometimes there is like a mid-range of short and long term. So for me, if going back to the coping example, if I had something to cope with, so for example an exam, it is technically short term, but it will probably have quite a long lasting effect on me, but not quite long term. So what I would do is completely reduce all of my coping. I would not try to cope with anything that ordinarily I would push myself to do. So I would try and limit unnecessary social interactions. I would stick to foods that are very simple, that I know I like, that aren't going to cause any sensory experiences. I would just basically take it right back to basics. If it was something more severe, so if it was something like grief, then I would take it back even further and have more alone time, reduce all interactions, not necessarily because I didn't want to speak to people, just because it's less things to cope with. And it's just about constantly managing that level of coping. So moving on to mental health. Obviously, being autistic, it's the same as being neurotypical in that mental health conditions do also occur. At the University of Liverpool, there's a lot of focus on mental health being a completely valid reaction to a really bad situation. So we tend to think of it less of a condition and much more of a human response. And for that reason today I'm going to focus on anxiety and depression, because those are states of being that at some point in our lives we all experience to some degree in response to a situation. But looking at diagnosis temporarily, researchers found that autistic people are more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety, eating disorders, depression. But another thing that's interesting is that autism interacts with mental health. So when you pull up signs for mental health conditions, let's say depression, you're not going to be looking for the same things in a neurotypical as you are in an autistic person. An autistic person is going to have a very different presentation of their mental health to what a neurotypical would have. And that can be quite difficult in accessing support, or if you wanted a diagnosis, in accessing that diagnosis. So there's two parts to this. The first part is that being autistic, mental health can just suddenly become difficult. And normally that's in response to a situation that's happened that has absolutely nothing to do with being autistic. However, it does impact your autistic traits. So first of all, there's less coping available. So instantly you're talking every day 2 to 3 blocks might have been taken up by the mental health difficulty or whatever's caused the mental health difficulty. So you then have to factor in, how do I help my coping better during this period of time? Also more likely to have overload, meltdown, shutdown and burnout. So we've talked about overload and meltdown, so overload being too much input, meltdown being the response, which is a sudden loss of control and not coping. Shutdown is a response to meltdown usually, sometimes a response to overload, where we just try and shut off all our senses. So if I'm in shutdown, I become very unresponsive. Normally I don't speak very much, or I'll just repeat the same thing over and over again. Usually we'll try and shut down some of our senses, so sitting in a dark room with no sound. It's a pretty good mechanism in the short term, but it's not a good mechanism in the long term. Research has found that it can be very harmful and traumatic. And a more sort of longer term outcome of meltdown is burnout, which is where you just feel extremely fatigued. Sometimes there's guilt, especially if the meltdown happens in public. Just a general bad outcome of how you feel. And those things all happen much more frequently when mental health becomes a factor, and that's just tying back to the fact that coping's less, basically, there's more to cope with. Often worsened social isolation as well, and that's just because social interaction takes up a lot of coping. The difficulty is that mental health, basically a lot of mental health conditions make you not want to be around people. You feel like a burden, or you just can't cope with what if that person's thinking something bad about me. And so it sort of draws you into yourself and away from people. So when you've got somebody who's autistic who might also struggle with social isolation and find social interaction a lot to cope with, that becomes a really big difficulty, and it's probably the most important thing to focus on when mental health's a factor, is making sure that that person's got people to reach out to, people that they will still speak to even if they're not going out and interacting in the same way. Change also becomes much more difficult, so anything unpredictable feels completely exacerbated. And also we have less masking. So basically when we talk about autistic masking, what we mean is every day when an autistic person leaves the house and they don't want to be judged negatively, we will try and consciously change how we are. So I will try and use more body language because I know that naturally I wouldn't ordinarily. I will try and use some inflections in my voice even though that's more difficult for me. I will purposely ask questions that I know people are expecting me to ask. And I won't do things that people will find strange, like stimming or talking about certain topics in a very intense way that other people just wouldn't know about. Masking is pretty harmful for us because it impacts our self-identity. We start to struggle with, well, who am I if every time I leave the house I'm having to mask who I am? The problem is that if all of a sudden you've got mental health to factor in and your masking just disappears without any sort of communication with the people around you, for example in work, that person then won't know how to support you because all of a sudden they've gone from being used to you with your masking habits to you with no masking at all, and all of a sudden they will panic and think, I don't know how to support this person. So it's about thinking of these things in advance and just letting people know what might happen in a time of mental health difficulty. And also other more positive coping mechanisms can be forgotten or go away. So if you've got a long-term or a short-term plan, that can be really difficult to implicate when there's mental health difficulties going on. So although mental health can arise from a completely external thing and impacts your traits, vice versa is that being autistic can sometimes worsen mental health. And as a result, this ties back to what I said earlier, being autistic changes the presentation of what mental health difficulties look like. So the biggest issue, what I found, is that when you're autistic, because you don't understand the stimuli response of what's made you feel that way, what things have contributed to poor mental health, and it might not be one event, it could be numerous things, but the struggle with knowing what's caused it and what your emotions mean can mean that the difficulty goes on longer than it needs to. And this is the importance of having other people who can be around and say, well, I've observed, and I think these things have contributed to your lack of coping, and then that's tied into mental health. So obviously there's difficulty knowing what's caused it. There's difficulty sometimes as well in knowing that you've got a mental health difficulty. So for me, often I will just think, oh, I'm having overload a lot, oh, I'm having a lot of meltdowns. And it takes somebody else to say, okay, I think you have mental health difficulties. And this is really problematic because, again, it can get quite severe before an autistic person reaches out for help because they've got no idea that they've been experiencing a mental health difficulty. And there are also just issues in communicating feelings. So, for example, when we talk about physical health, it's something that autistic people struggle with. If we've got to go to the doctor with a migraine, some autistic people might say, you know, I've got a stomach ache in my head. We don't quite know how to verbalise something that's happening inside us in a way that somebody else will understand. This is even more so with emotions and mental health because it's something so subjective, and often we just think, you know, I feel really bad and I don't know why. That can be enough to communicate, and again, it's about balancing that, so just communicating in the way that you have available to you that you're not feeling as good as normal, and then letting other people sort of ask questions or observe your situation to find out if there's a problem. Also, difficulties that are linked to autism can cause mental distress. For me, that was around self-identity, stigma from other people. That's pretty much been the main thing. I personally don't think anything else about being autistic has been negative for me. I don't think if I was in a supportive environment constantly through my life, I ever would have had mental distress from being autistic. It's just that if you're in an environment where you're not supported or you're not well understood, then mental distress will arise. So talking about personal experience, I don't want to make it sound like once you're diagnosed, all of a sudden mental distress disappears. But for me, diagnosis is really important because it changes the mental health difficulties that you face to become much more manageable. And like I mentioned in the last slide, it becomes much more about having a supportive environment. Whereas before diagnosis, there's so much going on to process. So for me, I didn't know I was autistic until I was 18, that's when I was diagnosed. And actually, I was just referred to a mental health service because the doctors had no clue what was going on. They assumed I had a mental health difficulty. And it wasn't until I met the psychiatrist that she said, okay, no, you're just autistic and you've never realised. But there are a lot of difficulties around self-identity before you're diagnosed because you constantly realise that the people you're around are different from you. However, for me, I just always thought those people are different, something about them is different. I'm the average person because I'm what I know. And that's a real difficulty because often we don't know that there's something about us that is significantly different. Self-diagnosis is completely valid if somebody's lucky enough to realise prior, I'm autistic. Whether they pursue a diagnosis formally or not, then that can still alleviate self-identity difficulties. Whereas for me, I had no clue, so there was just lots of difficulty around why do I mess things up? Why do I seem to get things wrong when I'm trying to do the right thing? And that can then tie into feelings of anxiety and depression. As a result, for me, I just chose to opt for social isolation. It was easier to be alone and not mess up and not start having a self-identity crisis because I just ultimately felt like I had no control, especially in social environments, not in terms of how I was. I just had no control over outcomes, so I would try and engage with people socially and somehow it would still go wrong. So after diagnosis for me, these things got a lot better in that I found out who I was. The problem was that forming a new self-identity is extremely difficult in itself. So when you're somebody who doesn't cope well with change and things that you now have to process that changes in your environment, finding out that everything about you is not quite what you thought is a really, really big process. And this is where it's crucial to have supportive people around to seek out positive information saying that you don't have to change. Being autistic is a really great thing. Because it's basically going back through your mind to every experience you've had, every difficult encounter you've had, and thinking, that's why that happened. Now that I know I'm autistic, that makes sense. And for me, it took about 2 years to go through the process of realigning who I was and accepting, okay, all this stuff is fine, I'm just autistic. The problem then, once you've gotten to that stage, is, do I tell people? If I tell people, will there be stigma? Will they treat me negatively? The truth is that it's variable. For me, thankfully, most people are being fantastic. I don't often get stigma. I don't often get people being mean or anything negative. However, there have been situations where disclosure has led to stigma, to bullying, and it's just about being very aware. It's about knowing if you realise something's wrong, if you think somebody's being negative, that's valid enough. And then working on that. If you can work with the person, great, on educating them that autism is a really good thing, you don't have to be this way. Sometimes seeking external support is necessary though. So looking at what anxiety and depression was around for me before diagnosis, I asked an awful lot of questions, usually around things that made me anxious naturally. So if something was wrong with my health, if I was anticipating something really scary at college, I would constantly ask questions. The difficulty was, because I had now learned that other people don't always tell the truth, whereas autistic people are very literal and very truthful, I was scared that the person wasn't giving me an honest answer, so that question would be repeated about 10 times a day, usually to family, because I would be looking, has the response changed? Is there something they're not telling me? And as a result, I got intrusive thoughts, which was also from the focus on, am I doing things right? Am I doing things wrong? I started to get a lot of guilt, which tied into depression, around my behaviour, thinking everything I did was wrong, and constantly coming away from a social situation and thinking, oh my God, I've just upset that person somehow and I don't realise. And it probably wasn't even true, it was just the mental health difficulties that arise. So I ended up with much more difficulty around other people, and as I said before, I just ended up avoiding social situations because when I wasn't around people socially, I was happy being autistic, and so I had no difficulties with mental health whatsoever, other than thinking back over the event, which I didn't really have to do if I didn't go out and socialise. But that's a problem because when I wasn't socialising, it also meant that I had no support outside of family. So there was no people to reach out to and talk about things that were happening or that were difficult. Also had more frequent meltdowns, which is much more terrifying when you don't know what a meltdown is. It feels like, what the hell is going on with me? So that was the most difficult part for me, and that was why I sought out help through a doctor, because having more frequent meltdowns and not understanding what they were led to worse mental health afterwards. So that tied into burnout. I would have burnout for about a week after a meltdown back then, whereas now it would probably be an hour. And it just basically tied back into these negative feelings all the time. So I'm not going to talk too much about mental health afterwards because I pretty much summarised before in that it's only been a problem linked to autism when somebody's being negative or stigmatising. So looking at how mental health coping can improve for autistic people, the biggest thing for me is having supportive individuals, people who you can contact with absolutely anything that's gone wrong, that's happening to you, that makes you feel negative, and saying, I just don't feel good right now, I think I'm going to have a meltdown, anything that you're worried about, and that person just being able to say, how can I help? Rather than trying to explain that something's wrong with you or making you feel worse about it. Special interests, as I keep coming back to, are a huge factor for me. They help me to focus on things, they help me to feel much better. So when I've had the worst mental health experiences, a special interest has changed in a couple of days because it's something that I know is just going to make me feel instantly fantastic. If it's autism-based coping, for me it's important to deal with the overload, the thing causing the overload and the difficulties around that. if all of a sudden I was to start seeming anxious and the problem was because something was putting me into overload, it would be completely useless to tackle the anxiety because I'm still going to go into overload and eventually that anxiety will come back. However, if it was mental health based, it would alternatively be pointless to try and deal with autism and overload and meltdown. Instead, it would be much better to look at the situation that's creating the mental health difficulty. So sometimes it's really hard to separate because something that's causing your mental health difficulty is probably also causing overload. But it's about dealing with the trigger rather than any of the conditions, basically. And self-evaluation is crucial, so just constantly keeping track of anything you're coping with, anything that might cause mental distress or any difficulties for you at all. In the beginning for me, I did try and keep a strong note on this, so I'd write it down, or I'd be constantly analysing what things in my day have caused me to cope less. Whereas now I just do it on automatic, so I don't need notes, I don't need to think about it too much. It's just I'm constantly acknowledging, right, that's took up coping, that thing was difficult. And then if I get to the end of the day and I'm not coping, all of a sudden I'm in overload, then I know these are the things I can trace it back to, and now I can put something in place to try and bring back some coping. So just to talk a little bit about mental health therapies, they are the go-to, especially if you seek out support with the medical profession. They tend to try and help your mental health difficulties with therapy. For me, that was completely problematic. For me, I was put in for CBT, which I thought was pretty useless because at the time I was just trying to adapt to being autistic. I had a lot of things I couldn't control in my life, like grief of a family member passing away. And CBT just made no sense to me. Also, though, was the fact that it really needed adapting. And if you read Tony Attwood's book on Asperger's, which we now also just call autism, he talks about how you can adapt a therapy to be suitable for an autistic person, and his recommendations are brilliant. They will completely work. To give an example for me what was happening, first of all, the therapist sat me down and spent about 3 weeks talking about fight or flight response. I was a psychology student, I spent weeks learning about this. First time I explained it to her, she said, okay, that's great, I don't need to tell you, and carried on telling me every week. And that made me feel quite patronised. Also, just things like when she was asking me to think of a place I'd never been that was relaxing, I couldn't do that. Trying to explain to her, I've never been there, how would I know what the weather's like or what the place looks like? She just couldn't grasp that. Her other patients could do it, but I couldn't. And then things like asking me to do focused breathing, I was way too anxious and uncomfortable to do that in front of somebody. I'd experienced so many times in my life where I'd made social errors, I did not want to sit and breathe in a funny way in front of somebody. And I did actually go to her and say, these are the ways you can adapt the therapy to make it work for me, but it wasn't that she was a bad therapist, it's just that she didn't know how to adapt it. She was so used to the way she'd done it. And unfortunately, the service I was with just didn't have somebody who had the skills to tailor it. So therapy can be problematic in that way. It's not always necessarily a bad thing if you can find somebody who will tailor it when you need it. But ultimately for me, I've just always stuck to supportive people and working on things myself because it was pretty much the only option. It is hugely dependent on the client-therapist relationship. It's not that either one is in the wrong, it's just finding a therapist that works for you as an autistic person. Your therapist might be fantastic for neurotypical people, but absolutely dreadful at adapting things for somebody who's autistic. And ideally what we want is what we call an intervention that can act as mental health support. There have been a lot of problems with the term intervention in that people have tried to develop techniques to change autistic people, change our behaviour, and that can include telling us not to stim, rewarding us for not doing autistic behaviours. But when we talk about intervention, that's not at all what we mean. We don't want to change autistic people in the research we do here. What we want to do is support them to better understand themselves and other people if and when they want to. And those generalistic supports we hope can help with mental health. So for example, my research is on how reading can be a support for autistic people. And that was for years of using it myself, reading books where there was social anxiety or people similar to me, situations similar to mine, where I could then understand it a bit better. So when I went into that situation, I was less anxious and as a result, less mental distress. reading's not the only one. There are absolutely plenty of very basic supportive things that we can do for interventions. You don't necessarily need a professional to do them, although we are looking at ways that we can adapt interventions in a professional environment. I completely done that just by myself for months on end, and it was still just as helpful for me. So that's the end of the talk, but if anyone's got any questions, feel free to ask now, or you can contact me if you don't want to talk in person.